I'm currently president of the Victorian Association for Restorative Justice, which was formed not quite 10 years ago by a group of colleagues in Melbourne who came from various fields: education, youth justice. People in this room here today who have some association with restorative justice. In fact, I'm going to do a few straw polls here. So how many people have at some point been a member of the Victorian Association for Restorative Justice? Yes, okay, that's about 10% of the audience. And then I think more than 10% of the audience are actually conveners of some sort or another. How many youth justice... Russell Jeffrey thought he could sneak in unannounced. He's going to put his hand up there. He actually coordinates the program in Victoria. And so he and Katrina are among the more experienced youth justice conveners, but in fact there's a whole series of experienced youth justice conveners who turned up from the Brosnan Centre in Melbourne. You've come all the way from Melbourne just to up the numbers. That's good. Thanks, folks. Not just no. So if you're interested in that particular field and want to corner any of those people during the break, I know they're all very friendly and happy to talk with you. But look, let's talk about how the work that we're doing overlaps with the work that Rob and Mary are doing through the Centre for Innovative Justice. I did get involved in this field 20 years ago with the the pilot program of Youth Justice Conferencing, and at the time I was coordinating a Justice Studies program in New South Wales with Charles Sturt University. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, talking to the right people, and we were able to set up a program that at the time had no new legislative basis, but just provided an opportunity for actually the police in their local patrol. We had a sympathetic senior officer, one Christine Nixon, who allowed us to do whatever we wanted as long as it was legal. And we're able to show, in fact, as we'd predicted, that we significantly reduced reoffending in that patrol area relative to the rest of the state, and the only explanation was that we were in fact bringing people who were involved together and allowing them to come up with a negotiated response that actually worked. And some of you may know, I think it was just early this year, that a Campbell collaboration report, that's an international project that looks at meta-studies of different programs in medicine and other areas, looked at 10 evaluated restorative justice programs for young people and adults as well, and it showed that 9 of those 10 showed a statistically significant reduction in reoffending, and they all showed the levels of satisfaction among victims that Rob was talking about. The one that didn't, interestingly, was New South Wales. And what if you read that report carefully, what it actually shows is that the state government there has progressively defunded the centralised quality control of training and doesn't provide for monitoring or follow-up of agreements. So that particular report doesn't show that conferencing isn't effective. It just shows that if you don't fund programs properly, they don't work all that well. Unfortunately, the people who wrote the report agree that in private, but that was not what they were paid to write. So that's my cynicism coming out after 25 years in academia. But it's all right, I'm largely not cynical because I'm working in a field full of good people doing good work. So what we've seen in the 20 years is the Youth Justice Conferencing develop in all Australian states and territories to different degrees. I happen to think the Victorian program is one of the best administered ones. And several of us were talking before the program started here today about the fact that the Queensland government, in its wisdom, has just defunded the court-referred program, which has no basis in anything other than ideology. It's not a money saver because, as we know from various reports that have been written about these programs, they actually save money when they're set up properly. Apart from being morally and ethically superior, they save money. So you have to have some very strange ideological commitments to defund these programs, but as Rob said, with the mental health legal support, there's some very strange ideological commitments at work at the moment. But But while there's some very odd policy being written by state governments and the federal government, this is actually a time where there's some very creative and valuable work being done at the community level. And so in Victoria, for instance, the family-led decision-making program is being expanded, and there's a direct conversation happening between the folks involved in youth justice conferencing and family-led decision-making. And last year there was an interesting training run, and there's, again, several people in this room were at that, where we talked about the commonalities in practice between those two activities. So getting people together where you have to make a decision about the care and protection for young people, and bringing people together in cases of in youth justice matters. Now, in the last year I've also had the opportunity, and it's a privilege, to be involved in a federal program which was set up just before the Labor administration left office by the previous Defence Minister Stephen Smith, who commissioned this Defence Abuse Response Taskforce following a several-year inquiry by the law firm DLA Piper. Now, I thought it's actually worth talking about this before we get to what we're discussing on the panel, where Carolyn Worth from the Centres Against Sexual Assault can give you some more detail about the practicalities of applying the sorts of ideas Rob was talking about to real cases where victims of sexual offending are actually saying, I need to meet, not necessarily always with the perpetrator, but with the people who matter to me in my life to work out how I can deal with the physiological harm, so physiological, psychological harm, and the psychosocial harm. So everybody in our family doesn't talk to each other anymore, which is a common result of those sorts of cases. What we've been finding is, since last year, when we began running what are called restorative engagement conferences for the Defence Abuse Response Taskforce, a series of us who are quite experienced facilitators have experienced a lot of what we expected to see, and, as you normally hope, some things we didn't expect to see, which are actually really interesting, that we've learned something from. So what I thought I'd take you through briefly some of our lessons from this Defence Abuse Response Taskforce, because they, as we understand it, map directly onto how you go about setting up some sort of restorative conference that would work in sexual assault cases. So how many people here have actually followed at all the Defence Abuse Response Taskforce? Or there's a couple of people with a defence background, which is very useful, and you can talk to them during the break as well. But essentially how this came about was, again, that Stephen Smith as Minister of Defence got to the point where he said, I have to act on the number of complaints that are coming to me as Defence Minister. You know, this is a systematic problem, and we need a systemic response to it. And so the DLA Piper report looked at several thousand cases, in fact, of people who had experienced some form of abuse, either individual incidents or ongoing, not all of it sexual, but some form of significant abuse during their time serving in the Army, Navy or Air Force. And the task force that was then effectively got up and running last year, in 2013, is taking cases that have been looked at administratively and assessed to be plausible. So again, going back to the point Rob was making, a lot of these cases, if you look at the evidence, they're far more than plausible. They almost certainly did happen exactly as described, but they don't pass the threshold in an adversarial court system for beyond reasonable doubt or on the balance of probability. So the next threshold is plausibility. And what people involved in those cases are offered, so people who are designated as complainants are offered, is one, two or all three of counselling, a reparation payment, which is, and all of these are assessed and dealt with by different arms of the administration that's overseen by Federal Attorney General's Department. So reparation, counselling, and the option of a restorative engagement conference. So at the moment, about 1,000 people have put their hand up to engage in a restorative engagement conference, and I think it's about 30 or 40 have already done so. And originally the idea was, well, if this is restorative justice, so you have to meet with your perpetrator. And what the people assessing the cases found was that most complainants said, I don't have any particular interest in meeting with the perpetrator. Whether this was something that happened a couple of years back, or 5 years back, or 10 years back, or in some of these cases 30, 40 years back. So in fact, the largest single body of people who were affected were the recruits who went into the naval facility HMAS Lewin and Fremantle in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, and there's been a big report tabled to Parliament in May on that. And then the next largest cohort were at ADFA after 1986. So yeah, and many of these did involve sexual assault, not all of them. I can tell you the cases that didn't necessarily involve sexual assault were still extraordinarily traumatising. I've convened about 7 or 8 of these now, and they're all very sad stories, and they're all also fascinating. And I mean that with absolute respect, because the complainants themselves actually say that at the end, as do the people they meet with, who are not the perpetrators per se, but a currently serving senior representative of one of the 3 services. So what the program involves then is one of about the 200 top ranking defence personnel, so that's about the 100 top Army personnel and top 50 from Navy and Air Force. One of them sitting down with the complainant and typically a designated supporter. So there'll be 4 people in the room, the chair, the complainant and their supporter, and this senior military representative. And so General Hurley, for instance, who's just retired, went through 4 of these by choice, and so did the heads of service. And basically everybody who, as a defence rep, attends one of these is in a position to do something with the story they're told. Now, you might have some preconceptions or guess at what the dynamic of this is like, but they're quite extraordinary encounters, and the youth justice conveners in the room wouldn't be surprised to hear that a lot of the work actually occurs not in the Restorative Engagement Conference but in the preparation beforehand. Thanks for nodding, Genevieve. I wouldn't feel reconfirmed if you didn't nod. But, so let me just go through what we think is happening and how this maps directly onto the good practice that we're hoping will occur when, in responding to the growing requests from victim survivors of sexual assault, meetings are held with the people they want to meet with, assuming they've gone through some sort of gatekeeping process of the sort Rob was describing. So what we noticed hold on. Technical difficulty solved. So what we noticed early on with the complainants with the Defence Abuse Response Taskforce is that pretty much all of them, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear this, were describing some form of traumatic stress. So recurring flashbacks, as they're called, so intrusive memories that were having profound effects and had profound effects not only on their own lives but on the people they lived with and their extended network of family and friends. And again, many of you working in this field will know a lot about this and not be surprised to hear that. What's been really striking though, and this program's been very carefully watched, and so from day one the actual conferences have been properly evaluated. We had a senior researcher, Andrea Durbach, who was actually an evaluator with the Truth and Justice Commission in South Africa, who's currently at University of New South Wales, actually sat in and watched most of the first 20 of these conferences to try and work out what's actually going on and why are they working. And what was really striking was every complainant said, well, this has had a profound effect for me in a positive sense, and particularly therapeutically. even where I've been going to counselling, and this is no slight on counselling or various other services, for years, that's sort of maintained me and helped me to manage, but this has actually shifted me. So the question is why. That raises the really interesting question of why does this seem to be as therapeutic as it is, and what else is it achieving? And in a nutshell, what it seems to be achieving is physiological therapy and social reconnection for the complainants and family members. And it seems to do that as it's doing something profound for the Australian Defence Forces, which is an institutional learning program the likes of which they've never had before. So the top 200 people have all put their hand up to sit in a room on up to 5 occasions, and that's it. Once you've done 5, your work here is done. So they're not actually allowed to attend more than 5 for a number of reasons. But the idea is that within 2 years there'll be nobody in the senior ranks of the Defence Force who hasn't sat and listened to a series of stories about how, in the absence of really good governance and vigilance, you can very quickly descend into the Lord of the Flies situation. Shorthand term, but it's remarkable what can go wrong and how quickly it can go wrong in an institution. Those of you who work in schools will know the same thing. So what we're talking about is trying to understand not just the impact on victims of crime and abuse, but how to avoid it by insightful, informed, wise governance. And so basically what seems to be happening is, again, this won't be news to most of you, but it's just a way of describing what's going on, that people who are experiencing post-traumatic stress are remembering incidents where they experienced a risk of death or a loss to their sense of physical integrity. And what we understand seems to be happening is that the memories of those events are so intense they're not actually properly contextualised in the brain. It's getting into neurology here, but so that they don't actually appear in a sort of timeline. They're continually re-experienced as if they're in the present. And this awful feedback loop occurs where every time you have an intrusive flashback, you're reminded not only of the time when you lost control, but it's compounded by the sense that you don't have any control over that now. And what we're finding is quite profound, and I've had this literally with every one of the conferences I've run, and the other conveners in the original phase 1 trial found the same thing, is if you sit and talk with complainants about how they're going to relay what they want to relay to the defence representative, they really struggle to tell the story as a cause and effect narrative. So one thing led to another. What you get, and again, many of you in this field will be familiar with this, is a series of memories triggering other memories. And it's very hard to follow the story. And in fact, what you find is they've never actually had the opportunity to tell the story of what happened from start to finish, back from the time when almost invariably they entered the defence with high hopes and expectations and this sense of belonging. And in fact, the more they came from a defence background, so had parents who were in one of the services, the more this is the case. So it all makes sense logically. But what's really striking is how profound the activity of sitting down and rehearsing how we're going to tell what happened to us and why that matters actually allows people to rejig in their own minds how they make sense of what happened. And then what's really profound is the act of telling that to someone who can do something with the story. So you can do something with it, this is a phrase that keeps coming up, means they can let go of it. And in the first conference I ran, literally, they had a very articulate complainant who'd had awful things happen to him in the 1970s, had written a lot of stuff down in advance. And I said, look, since you've gone to the trouble of writing that, why not print it off as a list of your lessons from your experience? And he said, do you think I won't mention who the senior person was, a very senior defence person, do you think they'll be interested? And I said, well, it's interesting, you've gone to the effort, they're bothering to meet with you, why not actually hand it to them? He said, you know what, I'm going to do that. And at the end of the conference, after we'd had this long discussion, he handed them to his list of lessons to the senior defence representative, who looked through them and said, yeah, that's actually extremely helpful. Some of these we have actually implemented, but not all of them. And actually, you've made me think differently about what we would need to do to go beyond, again, as Rob was saying, just writing reports and actually make sure that this stuff lives. And the fellow told me afterwards, he said, that was the moment at which I really did feel I could let this go and get on with the rest of my life. And time again, people saying that. So what seems to be happening is, this is an example of why, at the heart of it, all these restorative processes work, whether they're run as an alternative to the adversarial process or as an adjunct. They involve a narrative response where people describe what's happened to them. Those who matter to them for whatever reason respond to it. There's an exchange where we all have an understanding collectively now that none of us had fully at the outset, and if necessary, we make plans. So in fact, another way of thinking of that is this whole approach, whether it's youth justice conferencing, the adult applications that we've got in a couple of states and jurisdictions, ACT and South Australia, the workplace applications we're starting to see now, family-led decision making, or these innovative programs such as the DART, which is being looked at by the other English language democracy, industrialised democracies. Certainly the armed forces in the States and Canada and the UK are looking at this program and say, okay, well that's a smart way of running institutional reform, even as you offer a therapeutic response to the people who've been affected. So in a sense, you're getting two outcomes that support each other. So sort of a rejigging of a person's relationship to themselves and their supportive community, and with that a really unusual opportunity for institutional reform. Of course, I haven't mentioned the state inquiry and the Royal Commission into abuse in custody. That's probably self-evident that these sorts of lessons will have applications there over time. And just to rehash, again, the conveners in the room will be very familiar with this, but what we've also found is that these sorts of processes all have at the heart the capacity to move people emotionally in a good way to the point where they can make constructive decisions. So Rob alluded to the sort of unconstructive decisions we've had in justice policy over the last 30 years. Interestingly, the States has got to the point now where you've got bipartisan admission that the last 30 years of prisons policy has been collective madness. You have 2 million people in jail now in a way that hasn't made the place any safer. It's actually made the states that have the highest rates of incarceration are the most dangerous, because you're locking people up. Let's not get into that, it's kind of obvious, and I'm talking to the converted. But what's interesting politically is that we've still got a bit of that going on here in Australia, but we're inevitably going to get to the point, if not for moral or ethical reasons, for budgetary reasons, where we really are forced to decide whether we want to spend more money on prisons or spend what we've got on schools and hospitals and public transport and the like. And it turns out the more moral and ethical and effective ways of doing this stuff are the cheaper ones as well. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, one of the reasons why we call this transformative justice is that it tends to have a transforming effect on the emotions of those involved, so that when you have people who are in conflict for whatever reason, and this certainly applies to the people who are engaging with the Defence Abuse Response Taskforce, they start in this state, in a state of anger and fear and disrespect and extreme distress as well. When a narrative process is set up properly, they quickly move to this state where people are talking about things that have happened rather than the state that they're permanently in. I won't dwell on this. This is a complicated business. Don't get hung up on the word shame. We don't have time to talk about this now. Forget I ever said it. But people get to the point of collective vulnerability, which is the point where they're prepared to say, we're all in the same boat, we can move on. And it's quite remarkable. Again, the youth justice conveners in the room will be very familiar with this magic moment, as it's called, but it's really interesting to see how it's also created in the family-led decision-making meetings, Defence Abuse Response Taskforce, and also indeed in workplace interventions using the same approach. And there are some people in the room here who do that sort of work and are familiar with it. At the point where the collective story has been told and we've got a common understanding of how we got here, that's the first point at which it's safe to say, all right, how are we going to make it better? If you ask how are we going to make it better when people are angry and fearful and contemptuous, you get Californian prison policy, which we're currently trying to replicate here for some reason, after all Rob's efforts. But when you get the people who are really affected together and take them through this journey, they'll get to this point where they can experience something that is a real form of justice, where they've been given a voice. And interestingly, if any of you have read Kathy Daly's studies on intervening with sexual offending in South Australia, the victim survivors consistently say, well, justice for me is being given a voice, a capacity to participate, where people who've done the wrong thing are called to account in a meaningful way, but ultimately we have some form of healing and recovery and healing from the trauma. It sounds like a simple formula, and again, there's lots of people in this room doing this sort of work. So I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that, in effect, whichever of these programs you're involved in, at the core we're all doing the same stuff, which is providing an alternative to retribution as justice. It's defining justice as transformation, restoration, healing, which ultimately is what people really are asking for if those making the policy listen to them. And from time to time we get people who do, and then they get called adjunct. But that's a noble state to be in, Rob, and we're with you. So thanks for that.